tattletale sung, and a wave broke over the rainy bay. And every man knew, as the captain did too, it was the witch of November come stealing.
Shipwreck Tales with John McCrystal. Very famous one this week, famous for its depiction in art as much as anything else. We're talking about the wreck of the Méduse, which culminated in the raft of the Méduse, or the French name, which it was named, Méduse, 1816. John?
Yes, the Méduse. She's a frigate, a French warship. She was built in around 1810, so quite new when all this happened, which was 1816. She was around in time to be involved in some of the Napoleonic Wars, and she saw some minor action during those. She was 1,080 tonnes displacement, so quite big, 47 metres or 154 feet long, and carrying 44-odd guns. So quite new, quite spruce, quite fast, good solid vessel. She was appointed to take a number of people, a garrison of military people, soldiers, and a whole bunch of colonists for the French colony of Senegal on the west coast of Africa. The English had been there, then the French had tipped them out, the English had tipped them out again, and what was going on in 1816 is there'd been a treaty signed between the French and the English to bring the Napoleonic Wars to a close. The English had agreed to hand back to the French the town of Saint-Louis, which was at the mouth of the Senegal River, in those days the capital of the area that lay inland. The Méduse was on her way to deliver the new governor and basically everyone who would be required to run that colony to the new capital at Saint-Louis. What had gone on in France is that a new king had been brought back, the House of Bourbon had been restored, and pretty much everyone who was being appointed to any kind of government post was being appointed according to whether or not they were loyal to the House of Bourbon. And the man who was appointed commander of this expedition was a man by the name of Hugh du Roy du Chaumaret, I'll call him.
Yep.
He was loyal to the House of Bourbon and wasn't a particularly distinguished navigator or sea captain, but being one of the king's men, did it. Also aboard, of course, was the new governor of Senegal, Julien de Schmaltz, wonderfully named Governor Schmaltz.
Good heavens.
Along with his wife and his daughter.
Governor
Yes.
Chicken Fat.
Exactly right. Those two dignitaries were aboard. As I mentioned, lots of soldiers and then lots of handy people to run the colony. The Méduse also had a crew of 160, so all in all, there were just over 400 people aboard.
Is that a lot of people for a ship of this class?
I would have thought that's a hell of a lot of people. She did have a great big open gun deck, which could be pretty readily converted to accommodation, and I suppose it was.
This ship was sailing in somewhat of a convoy.
Yeah, she was sailing in company along with the store ship Loire, named after the river, of course, the brig Argus and the corvette Echo, who were also conducting other people for the new colony and, again, just a measure of protection at sea, I guess. They all had a lot of trouble getting away from France, as it turned out. They set off on the 17th of June in 1816, and it took them a couple of days actually just to get clear of the dangers of their own coast. And no sooner had they done so than a 15-year-old sailor aboard the Méduse was happily leaning over a rail with the rest of them looking at the porpoises in their pressure wave, and he fell overboard. They managed to get a rope to him, and he was being dragged along by that for a while, had to let go. A sailor at the stern managed to grab his hand, but again had to let go. They alerted the Echo, which was following in their wake, that someone had fallen over, but the Echo was too far back to be much use. Just a general paralysis among the commanding officers, it seems, to work the ship in such a way to render any assistance to this poor little guy. They did manage to throw a lifebuoy off, and you sort of hope that he didn't make it, because if he did, then he would have been floating around on it for as long as it took for him to die of exposure, because they never saw him again.
There does seem to be a sense of slackness throughout this procedure. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, again, it's coloured by the survivors' reports, and needless to say, they, for reasons which will become obvious, had no real stake in making the captain or the rest of the brass aboard this vessel look very good. Yeah, you do get the impression that there was just a lack of decision and just a lack of competence, really, among the afterguard on the Méduse.
And one of the things that they were slack about was keeping in contact with the other vessels once they managed to make it off the French coast.
Yeah, they were sailing in company, so standard procedure was when night fell, you were meant to burn lanterns to show other vessels where you were. And partly this was just so that everyone have the security of a whole bunch of navigators all keeping track of your position that way, rather than just your own navigator. It makes perfect sense just to at least keep in visual contact with the others. But apparently the officers of the watch aboard the Méduse were very slack about whether they hoisted lanterns at the appropriate moments and in response to signals from the other ships, with the consequence that they soon lost contact with the slower vessels in the flotilla. Just another sign of general slackness.
A moment which is very much like a pilot coming down from the cockpit in an airplane to economy class, saying, does anyone know how to fly a plane? This happened on the ship.
That's not a bad analogy at all, really. They were entering dangerous waters. Off the west coast of Africa, there's a great big shoal, an enormous series of reefs and sandbanks. It's well known. They've been reported by French officers who've been sailing these waters for a long time, and the instructions on how to avoid them are very clear. But as you say, the captain, de Chaumeray, hunts around among the passengers and finds a fellow named Richefort, who had been a French naval officer, but had lately been spending time in an English prison. He was apparently a member of the Cape Verde Philanthropic Society, which doesn't sound very nautical, and he was a philosopher by trade, apparently. Somehow, however, the captain of the Méduse decided that this was the man who would guide them through these dangerous waters to the port of St. Louis. One of the landmarks that they're looking for is a cape. What it signified is that at the moment you spotted it, you were in the vicinity of an enormous reef called the Bank of Arguin, which is the sort of northern limit of this enormous shoal off the coast of Mauritania. Somehow they confused a cloud bank for the cape. Opinion was apparently divided between those who had good eyes, and Monsieur Richefort and the captain and various others of the ranking officers, who were sure that this sort of long, low-lying smudge on the horizon must be the cape they were looking for. But supposing that they really had mistaken it for the cape they were aiming for, they then took the wrong action, because that was their signal to steer to the west to get around the limit of the reef that extended from it. Basically an enormous bar system, I guess, off the River Senegal, which drains the Sahara region. Instead what they did is plunge straight south. It's by now July the 2nd. They've been at sea for a little while. Things have gone relatively smoothly apart from the early glitches, but things start getting a bit unsettling for many of the passengers, some of whom didn't know anything really about how to sail a vessel at sea. But when they're looking out and they're seeing breakers around them, and when they're looking at the waves and they're actually seeing sand being dredged up by the waves, they begin to suspect that they might be in shallow water.
Oh dear, oh dear. We'll take a break and return with the wreck of the Méduse, which ended up as the raft of the Méduse, a very, very famous painting by Géricault, and of course copied by Charles Goldie with more of a Maori theme mythologised. Radio.
It's the Weekend Variety Wireless with Graham Hill.
Shipwreck Tales with John McCrystal. This week, the infamous wreck of the Méduse and the raft of the Méduse. They're off the coast of West Africa, and everybody's either forgotten how to sail a ship or just slackness and stupidity. They mistake a cloud bank for land, and then even if it was land, they make the wrong move, and they're in very, very shallow water with 400 people aboard.
They know they're heading into trouble, and yet they've taken every possible action that seems to continue steering deep into that trouble. They've even seen the Echo, one of their companion vessels, steer across their bow, heading out to sea, taking the correct action for these waters. The afterguard on the Méduse have all just sat there scratching their heads, wondering what the hell she's up to. She's disappeared, so they're on their own. It occurs to the officer of the watch, a navigator by the name of Morday, to do his calculations from his sun sights, and he places them on the chart pretty much right on the edge of this enormous reef that they're running towards. Slightly unsettled by this, he goes forward and personally throws the lead overboard to see how much water they've got, and finds they're in 18 fathoms. They ought not really to be finding much bottom if everything's going right. He reports this to the captain, who finally begins to believe that they might be in a bit of trouble.
18 fathoms, how deep is that in regular talk?
A fathom is 6 feet, so
Okay.
it's 108 feet.
That sounds a lot.
It's 54 metres, but the problem is there shouldn't be a bottom there at all.
Oh,
Yeah, so this is of concern to them. The captain orders the ship to be put to the wind, and she begins to sort of sluggishly come round to starboard to steer to the west. But at that moment, the lead begins reporting they have 5 fathoms. They're down to 30 feet of water. They're on the rapidly shoaling edge of this reef. They continue this sluggish manoeuvre to come to the wind, but it's too late. She heels over and then comes free. Then she heels over again, the wind driving her onto the sandbank, and then heels over for a third time as she sticks fast on a sandbank. They can't see land. They're 50 kilometres off the coast at this point, but they're firmly aground and they're in 5 metres of water.
Uh-oh.
Stuck fast. Not a good place to be. The wind at this stage is slight, the sea is moderate, so favourable conditions upon which to be stranded. Needless to say, the first action you take is you try to get your ship off. So what they do is they row the anchors out, they drop the anchors into the boats, and then row the boats as far as they can away, and then drop the anchors over the side. They successfully ditch the anchors far enough away to get some purchase on them, and begin using the ship's winch to start trying to drag her off. The most they can achieve in 2 days of trying is to drag the head of the ship around a bit. So she's basically stuck by the stern and she's pivoting on the stuck section. They lighten her as much as they can. They get as much of the cargo as they feel they can jettison and throw it overboard. It's been suggested that what they should do is in fact make a raft of some of it, so that if they get free of the sandbank they can drag it all aboard again and they've lost nothing. The one thing the captain of the vessel won't do is ditch the cannon. He's got these massive cannon, huge lumps of iron aboard, but he won't throw them over, presumably because should he sail into port having lost his cannon, his warship has lost much of its prestige, and that to a French naval officer seems to have been pretty paramount. The effort to lighten the ship proves fruitless, and it's half-hearted anyway. Again, just this lackadaisical half-heartedness that has seemed to characterise everything so far.
I understand that she foundered on this sandy reef at high tide, and so, you can't really wait 12 hours and hope for the best.
That's right. It was high tide, so she's stuck at the highest point of the tidal cycle, and in fact it was spring tides, as I understand as well, so higher than usual tides. So things are only going to get worse after that, and they did. She remained stuck fast, and on July the 5th, 3 days after she struck, a gale sprang up, and the ship began to show signs of actually breaking up. It hasn't got far to sink, of course, so the question then becomes, will the hulk of the vessel, stuck as it is, afford more protection than the open boats that she's carrying will? They clearly decided that abandonment was going to be necessary, so they built a raft. In doing this, they dismantled the masts of the frigate. They nailed timbers across the masts and then timbers across those and so on and so forth, so that you had this sort of crisscross arrangement of timber across the great big long masts. It's 20 metres by 7 metres, so it's a great big hunk of wood they've assembled here.
And this is over and above the boats that they have on board.
That's right. They've got quite a few boats aboard because, needless to say, they're supplying a new colony as well, and the governor's going to need a barge when he gets ashore, because you can't expect him to be rowed ashore in a jolly boat. So they've got one great big barge for him. They've got another great big barge as well. They've got the captain's boat. They've got another smaller boat, an even smaller boat, and then a tiny thing which is called a pirogue, which nearest I can work it, probably a small dinghy, I think. But either way, they've got 6 boats altogether. They range from 2 large boats right down to this tiny little, I expect, dinghy.
And I take it they've done the calculation it's not going to carry 400 people, hence the necessity to build a raft as well.
The purpose of the raft initially seems to have been to carry the cargo, but then as things begin to look more dramatic on July 5th with the storm springing up, they begin to consider the raft to be necessary to take some of the bodies that are going to have to be ferried ashore. Things surrounding the actual abandonment are pretty foggy. I mean, I've read the survivors' reports. There's just this haziness. People seem to be getting on and off the ship, and there seems to be a big dispute arising. And I think where the dispute arises and continues throughout what follows is it appears that most of the soldiers are put on the raft. There's this big list drawn up in any case that assigns places aboard particular boats or aboard the raft to every individual aboard the frigate. Trouble is, the moment the signal to abandon is given, what seems to happen is that the soldiers mostly end up on the raft, and then the sailors seem to sort themselves pretty quickly into the more seaworthy boats. So this enormous resentment starts right from the beginning of this debacle of the abandonment, where the soldiers find themselves in the most perilous position and they see the sailors looking after themselves. And that seems to have caused a bit of discontent, shall we say, that turns nasty in the days that follow. But in any case, the upshot of all this is that we have one of these large boats, the barge, with 35 people aboard, probably around a third of what it could have carried. That's the governor's vessel. There's another similarly sized vessel. These are just open boats, mind you. They're rowed, they're propelled by 14 oars, so they're still not huge vessels. There's another one of them that's got 42 aboard. There's the captain's boat, which ends up with 28 aboard, and then there's the longboat, which is it's basically an overgrown dinghy, but that ends up with 88 people aboard. There's a smaller boat, and that's got 25 aboard, and this tiny little dinghy, the pirogue, ends up with 15 aboard. All of those people are infinitely better off than those on the raft. There are 146 men and 1 woman aboard the raft.
Oh my goodness, 146.
That's right. And that sounds okay as long as it's going to float. But bear in mind that when 15 people had first climbed aboard the raft, they found that it was going underwater. There was only enough dry space aboard the raft with those 15 aboard for them all to crowd together standing up. Pile on the rest of those people, another 131 people, and you can imagine what their state was. They were basically in the water and just standing on the barely buoyant timbers of this thing.
What a pathetic sight that must have been.
Despite the fact that people had been assigned to various craft, as soon as the order to abandon was given, everyone just rushed for whatever they thought was going to give them the best chance of survival. Except, it seems, for the soldiers who were disciplined enough to follow their orders and ended up on the raft. One of the survivors, at least, a man by the name of Cocheard, ended up on the raft because he was ordered to take up his station there. He's a naval officer. He was one of the very few who actually followed orders. And when the governor's barge took off, as we said, there were 35 aboard that. It probably could have taken 3 times that number. And when it was seen leaving the vessel, apparently there was such outrage aboard the frigate amongst those who still hadn't abandoned that one of the soldiers was aiming his rifle at the governor with a view to shooting him. There were a few swear words flung across. Just opinion seems to have shifted against the governor at this point, as it would. The other vessel's not much better. The longboat, with 88 aboard, that initially left the vessel when they judged they were full up, but then they were ordered to turn back. And despite the fact they didn't really have oars and they were manoeuvring this vessel with a makeshift sail, they managed to get back alongside the frigate and they took off as many people as they dared, which left them with a complement of 88. But it should be noted that 17 people were left aboard the ship, and it's unclear to me whether they chose to be aboard, some of them clearly did, or some of them were just too drunk, there was a fair bit of that going on, or whether they were just left because the boats had filled and there was no room for them, and the raft didn't look too appetising. Even a ship aground probably feels more solid, I guess, than one of these tiny boats in a steep sea. And it's a steep sea in shallow water, so lots of breakers, lots of confusion. It would have felt like a pretty dire place to be, I think.
What was the deal with the raft? Is it just going to be floating out there or tethered?
The idea was that the raft would be towed, and what happened was the longboat took her in tow, and then one of the other vessels took the longboat in tow, and one of the other vessels took that boat in tow, and so it went. And the idea was that the combined efforts of the boats, both being rowed and with whatever sail they could spread, would drive them all inshore. They don't really know at this point how far away from shore they are, but they have a favourable breeze. It's blowing from the west and it's going to take them directly ashore. There was a bit of confusion amongst the boats, and 3 of them dropped the tow on the other 3. And at that point, it seems as though the governor or someone in his boat panicked and decided that the raft should be dropped. It's quite likely that the decision was taken that the raft was going to slow the progress of the boats and maybe jeopardise the survival of those in the boats.
Yep.
Yeah. So it seems as though a conscious decision was taken aboard that last boat, the longboat, that was towing the raft, to let her go. Apparently the governor, when he was taken to task about this later on, said that it happened by accident. But those aboard the raft were absolutely adamant, and they could even name the person who untied and cast the rope off in order for the longboat to sail away.
I've also heard that the people on the longboat were afraid of people coming from the raft onto the boat, following the rope out of desperation, because there are 146 people on this thing.
And it's not just 146 people. What seems clear to me is that there are 146, or the majority of those 146 are really pissed off with those in the boats.
Yeah.
Because we have soldiers aboard the raft and we have sailors aboard the boats. And there's some bad blood. There's been a lot of swearing and carrying on and brandishing of firearms and sabres. So there's this atmosphere of fear of one another that has set in from the moment of abandonment, and it's persisting.
And it gets worse. They've been cut adrift. Good luck. See you later.
That's right. I'll first deal with what happens to the boats, and then we'll come back to the raft, because we've got these 6 boats and all of them actually end up with their own differing fates. The longboat, which we've last mentioned, she actually saw land on the evening of the day that they abandoned. So they abandoned at 7 a.m. and then by nightfall they've spotted land already. So they weren't actually that far from land, around 50k off, and they got within a short distance of shore. Too dangerous to approach. It's very shallow water. They'd actually gone aground a couple of times because the water was only about a metre deep at times. There were places where you could probably have walked. But they decided that they were not safe trying to approach the shore at night, so they stood off. But the next day, the sight of land was too much for a lot of the people aboard. They just wanted to get ashore. 63 people were landed on the coast to the north, a place called Cape Merrick, which is around 120 miles from St. Louis. So they decided that they were better off trying to walk. They had pretty much nothing in the way of provisions, but they hoped that they'd be able to scrounge something ashore. The longboat, having dropped those 63, she's only now got around 25 people aboard, so she's in good shape, really. She decides she's going to sail for St. Louis, and on the way they see the other boats. They attempt to approach them in order to offer some of the spare space that they now have to some of the people in the overburdened other boats. But this atmosphere of fear is prevailing, and seeing the boat approaching with fewer of their number aboard than they had before, the fear is that these guys have done away with some of their shipmates and that they're basically coming to do for the rest of them. So the other boats actually do everything they can to keep their distance. It's not until much later in that day that the longboat manages to persuade the pirogue, which is just about going underwater anyway, to transfer their 15 people, and some from the captain's boat as well. They managed to land again, considerably closer to St. Louis, but still some distance away, about 60k, and they landed around 40 people there. The other boats also landed people piecemeal along the coast, and pretty much the universal experience of all of those who were landed was going pretty close to dying of thirst, because this is basically the edge of the Saharan desert. And were it not for the fact that pretty much everyone fell in company with Arab tribesmen who frequent the area, they would all have died either of hunger or thirst.
Many did die, didn't they?
Yep, many did. Not everyone was up to walking upwards of 40 to 50 miles, up to 100 miles across the Sahara. So yeah, there's quite a heavy death toll ashore as well. Some of them were picked up by the Argus, one of the vessels in the original flotilla, which had come to look for them, and they were the lucky ones. They arrived at St. Louis on the 13th of July, so only 11 days after the vessel was abandoned. It's a long time. It's the 23rd of July before those who were landed at the most distant point managed to make it. And of course, there'd been a few fall along the wayside there too.
Historical shame for France. The raft of the Méduse when we return.
Radio Live. It's Graham Hill's Weekend Variety Wireless.
Shipwreck Tales with John McCrystal. This week, the raft of the Méduse. The wreck of the Méduse, it's founded off the coast of Africa. They've cobbled together a raft and 146 people are aboard. They've been cut loose to fend for themselves off the coast of Africa. And this is the real story of the raft of the Méduse.
What seems to have happened next aboard the raft is, once the boats have disappeared, just the venting of whatever emotions that would have caused amongst those who are left aboard the raft. Conditions aboard the raft fall into 2 categories. Those in the middle, they've got it relatively good because they're at least out of the water some of the time, and most of the provisions are there. So they've got it okay there.
Just to reiterate, the raft isn't very buoyant. Most of it's under the water, and that's as good as it can float with this amount of people on it.
That's right. The front and the back seem to have been the worst places. Yeah, submerged timber to which people cling or on which they stand while they can when not being swept off by waves or what have you. It seems as though most of the sailors aboard the raft managed to commandeer the middle section, and most of the soldiers were on either the fore or the after part of the raft. There's what's described as a mutiny in the first night, whereupon those on the less habitable parts of the raft try rushing those in the middle. It seems incredible that you can have people, they would be in the same boat if they had a boat, they're all in the same predicament, but they're fighting. It seems as though around 20 didn't survive the first night.
Good God.
It just seems incredible. It's like rats in a cage in many ways.
Oh, and I understand they didn't have much water, but they had some wine.
That's right. I think they had about 2 casks of fresh water and the rest were wine. They had a lot of wine. There was no biscuit, there was nothing to eat. So basically the only sustenance they had was wine. That can't have helped moods either. The pattern was just repeated outbreaks of violence on the raft, to the extent where, having set off with 147 people on July 5, by July 9 there were only 67, it's estimated, left alive. More than half of them have either gone mad and thrown themselves overboard, or they've been killed by their shipmates, or they've just died as a result of accidents. Apparently on that first night when the gale was blowing, because this thing was made of crosshatch timbers, people were half falling into gaps and being just pounded to pieces by the surf and being trapped by bits of the raft. And so what was meant to be the instrument of their salvation ended up being the thing that killed them. But either way, over half of them dead only 4 days after the abandonment.
Good God.
Yep. Without food, of course, they take recourse to the only thing they can, and because they have dead bodies in abundance, cannibalism begins. That can't have done anything to soothe this fear and the loathing that's broken out amongst the various factions aboard this vessel, if you can call it that. The fear of being eaten must be lending a fair bit of impetus to the desire to win whatever battle is springing up at any given point, literally like rats in a cage. There was no spirit of cooperation at any point, it seems.
Is the woman still alive?
Yeah, she lasts quite a long time. Yeah, sort of around day 7. She's actually gone overboard a couple of times and she's been rescued by the sailors. Her husband's aboard as well, and there are tearful reunions between those two each time they cheat death. But it's too much, and in the end she does die just of whatever people are dying of at this point, besides being brutalised by their shipmates, presumably thirst, hunger, combination thereof. But either way, she's not around by day 8. On day 8, those who are left alive aboard this vessel are looking at one another, and because they have only a very small amount of wine left, the brutal decision is taken that anyone who doesn't look like they're going to make it is going to be tossed overboard, and that's what happens. That decision is taken by the 15 strongest people. So out of that 147 people, we're now down to 15 on day 8.
They basically overwhelm the weak and just throw them off the thing.
Yep, bodily throw them overboard, and that's that.
After the 8th day, there were another 4 days of this before rescue.
That's right. They're still drifting helplessly for 4 days. They try sailing for a little while, and whenever the wind's favourable, they hoist a sail to push them closer to the coast. Whenever it's unfavourable, they drop it again in the hope that their progress won't be too severely reversed. But after a while, they're so decrepit that they can't even work the sail, so the sail stays up regardless of the wind.
Okay.
And so they're drifting to and fro, in near shore, out again, without sighting land or anything that's likely to save them.
Right.
So it's day 12, where suddenly someone yells, "There's a ship," and they see a sail in the far distance. They don't really have any means of making a signal. They hoist one man up their makeshift mast. They all hold him up and he waves a flag, but soon enough the sail disappears. That's quite often a killer blow for people in this situation. Just the despair on top of everything else is enough to finish people off. They were lucky because a very short time later the sail reappeared. And this turned out to be the Argus, one of the vessels in their original fleet, who was in search of them. Well, in fact, this is the interesting part, she was not in search of them. They were aware that there was a raft, but so long had elapsed now, and so discouraging were the reports of how the raft was constructed, that they didn't expect there to be anyone left alive. So they, in fact, were looking for any survivors who might have been still straggling their way along the coast.
This is the very moment that's beautifully captured by Jericho, the artist, in the raft of the Méduse. You can see the ship just in the distance, and it is that moment that he is depicting in this painting. We have it up on the Weekend Variety Wireless webpage if you want to have a look there.
It's a lovely painting, and it's a beautiful tableau, and The only thing I would quibble with is just how well fed everyone looks, comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
They're not the emaciated skeletal figures that these guys would have been. So they were taken off on the 17th of July. What a feeling that must have been. It's just unimaginable when you've done unspeakable things to stay alive, and in many ways they've been justified by the fact that you have survived.
We'll take a break and come back with the aftermath of the raft of the Méduse. Infamy in French naval history, really.
It's the Weekend Variety Wireless with Graham Hill.
Shipwreck Tales with John McCrystal, the wreck of the Méduse, the raft of the Méduse, famously depicted by Géricault in the painting. This is the true story, though, of the raft of the Méduse, 15 only of 147 on this godforsaken raft, which didn't really float, mutiny, social breakdown, rats in a cage, and yet 15 have been rescued after 12 days with no supplies other than wine, which probably didn't help things.
Like the rest of the survivors who have straggled their way along the coast, the lucky ones being picked up by the Argus as she did her search, the unlucky ones having to hoof it on foot, everyone ends up at Saint Louis, which is this pestilential little town at the mouth of the Senegal River. Things don't go too well there either, really, because the English are still in charge, and seeing the shape in which the French, who are meant to be taking over the place with great pomp and ceremony, are arriving, the English refuse to hand over and cling on to power for a little bit longer, with the effect that the governor, who has survived, this is the man named Schmaltz and his detachment of ranking officers and military men disappear off to what's known as the Camp of Dakar. It's the present-day capital of this area, but in those days it was just a camp. And basically what that was a malarial hutch, really, on the shores of one of the more navigable parts of that coast. Basically a slaver's camp. He disappears off there. Not before some of the survivors from the raft have noticed that the governor and his wife and his daughter look on them with a kind of horror. And the horror can only really be not compassion for the state they're in, because they're just basically walking skeletons, but the fact that they've survived this at all. And in fact, if their story gets out, it's going to mean bad things for the governor, who was presiding over the ditching of the raft in the first place by the boats. It doesn't escape the attention of the survivors that the governor seems to regard them as undesirables. You weren't supposed to bring the story back to civilization. That was the gamble we took when we dropped you.
At this stage, does anybody wonder if anybody is still aboard the beached ship? 17 decided to stay.
As you'll recall, there were 17 still aboard. Whether they wanted to be there or not, there were 17 there. And one of the survivors, a man by the name of Monsieur Cochillard, was at dinner one night where the subject of these men came up. The captain of the vessel was there, and he said there would be no one left alive. It would be a miracle if there were more than 3. Cochillard said, surely if there are 3 alive, then we should be rescuing them. And the captain said something along the lines of, poof. And so that was that. However, he did decide he would send a schooner out to the wreck of the Méduse in an attempt to raise 100,000 francs of gold that were aboard. So a schooner was duly dispatched on the 26th of July. It took 8 days trying to beat her way up there against unfavourable winds, but in the end, the weather got the better of her and she limped back into port. So 14 days afterwards, she arrived back in Saint Louis. There were 10 further days required before she could be repaired to the point where she could have another go, and then she managed to sail to the wreck of the Méduse after all. Still sitting pretty on her sandbank, but it's now 52 days after she was abandoned.
All of these actions just expose a sort of moral decrepitude. Am I being too harsh? Is this the British translation of what's going on? Because they aren't really interested in saving people. They want the gold.
The account that I've read and that I've based my notes on is written by 2 of the French survivors in English translation. I don't believe there have been great liberties taken by the translators here, but the conclusion that the surgeon aboard, Monsieur Savigny, and Cochillard, who I've mentioned, he was one of the naval officers aboard, they basically describe those who are in charge of this whole debacle as disgraces to the name of Frenchmen. So the charges of moral decrepitude are from their own countrymen and those who were on the receiving end of it. I don't believe that it's a nationalist thing imposed by the English in telling the story. I believe that the conclusions were drawn by the French themselves.
So they've made it to the wreck of the Méduse stranded on this reef. What do they find?
They find that of the 17 people who were aboard, there are still 3 alive. And in fact, the story of those poor souls requires recording as well. The 17 who were left apparently managed to find enough biscuit and wine and brandy to last them for a little while. In fact, it lasted them for around 42 days. Now that's 6 weeks. 6 weeks aboard a broken boat, perched out of sight of land on a sandbank with absolutely no means of getting ashore. Just what that must have been like requires a bit of reflection. 12 of them apparently decided that the ship eventually was going to fall apart and that the promises of those who disappeared in the boats to raise help as soon as they could were worthless. They decided that they were going to build a raft of their own, the second and not so well known raft of the Méduse. So they cobbled together what they could, jumped aboard with provisions and disappeared, never to be seen again. Remains of the raft were found on the coast by the Arabs, so no survivors from that one. Another man apparently tried to float ashore. He threw the chicken coop over and jumped aboard it and tried to paddle his way toward the coast of Africa, 50 kilometres away. He apparently made it around 100 yards and then capsized, and he was not seen again. So we've lost 13 of those 17. That leaves 4. One of them died, apparently just within days or at least hours, I believe, of rescue. His body was thrown overboard. The other 3, when they were found, each had their own fortified area of the deck and were basically living in terror of the others. Occasionally one would venture forward, grab what he could from the stock of provisions and then beat a hasty retreat to his fortified area. But again, there was no cooperation here. There was just mutual fear, antipathy. It's extraordinary.
Did the captain get court-martialed?
Yes, he did. He was court-martialed, but he was only found guilty on relatively minor charges compared to the atrocity that this whole thing was. It was a major political scandal, needless to say. It was precipitated when Monsieur Savigny's account of the whole thing was accidentally leaked to the press. Accidentally can go in inverted commas. Either way, the press, and particularly the press that were against the ruling House of Bourbon, got hold of this thing and published it, and there was an outcry across France at what Frenchmen were accused of doing in this whole tragic episode. It then became a great big political scandal with claim and counterclaim of what went on aboard the Méduse between the beleaguered captain and governor and Messieurs Savigny and Coquillard. Eventually, it seems that the account of the survivors was the one that was believed, but the captain escaped without losing his life, as he must surely have done if the court-martial had found him guilty of the major charges.
And then Géricault paints that famous painting, and that's why it's so poignant. It has a political, scandalous spirit to it as well.
Absolutely. That sort of landed in the middle of this great debate over whether it was credible that Frenchmen would treat other Frenchmen that way. Throughout the survivors' account, there's just this mixture of disbelief and indignation that their own countrymen can behave this way. It's an extraordinarily nationalistic text to read. It's very, very pro-French, and yet it doesn't spare the French or the Frenchmen who are capable of the kinds of things that these poor fellows have suffered.
The Méduse was found in 1980.
Yeah, remarkably. In 1817, there was a French cartographic expedition in these parts, and she spotted the wreck of the Méduse still sitting firmly wedged on her sandbank, so they noted her position. In the 1980s, an expedition set out to find the wreck, and so good were the descriptions of where the vessel was last seen, they actually managed to find her. And on a sandbank, that must have taken some doing, because most bits get buried pretty rapidly amongst shifting sand. But they raised enough artefacts to positively identify her as the Méduse, and a lot of those artefacts are apparently still on display in the Museum of the Marine in Paris.
The shameful tale of the Méduse this week. John McCrystal, thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome.
Farther below Lake Ontario, Dick sitting with Lake Erie in the center. The iron boats go as the mariners all know, with the gales of November, remember. In a musty old hull in Detroit, they prayed in the maritime sailors' cathedral. The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. The legend lives on from the Chippewa down of the big lake they called it Sugar Lake. Superior, they say, never give sundry dead when the gales of November gone early.
Shipwreck Tales with John McCrystal. A full archive of all the Shipwreck Tales are replayable and can be found via the Weekend Variety Wireless webpage somewhere near the top. Enjoy your comfy bed.